7:43 on the morning of June 19, 1944, Lieutenant James Jimmy Hartwell gripped the controls of his Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber over the Philippine Sea, watching the Japanese carrier Shokaku grow larger in his windscreen. 23 years old, 18 combat missions completed. This was supposed to be his 19th. It would become the most important day of his life. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the largest carrier battle in history. 9 American aircraft carriers against 9 Japanese carriers. Over 1,500 aircraft filling the sky. The Japanese called what happened next the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots would shoot down over 350 Japanese planes that day. But for Jimmy Hartwell and his 2-man crew, survival was about to depend on something far more unexpected than American firepower. Hartwell's Avenger carried a 2,000-pound torpedo beneath its belly. His target was the Shokaku, one of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 30 months earlier. Intelligence officers had briefed the pilots that morning. The Shokaku was wounded, trailing oil from earlier bomb hits. One more torpedo could sink her. Every pilot in Air Group 15 wanted to be the one to deliver that killing blow. Hartwell's aircraft carried 2 other men. Aviation radio man 2nd Class Thomas Brennan sat in the belly of the plane, operating the ventral gun and monitoring the radio. Aviation machinist's mate 2nd Class William Billy Kowalski manned the dorsal turret, scanning the sky for enemy fighters. 3 men from 3 different states. Brennan was from Boston, Kowalski was from Chicago, Hartwell was from a small town in Oklahoma that most people had never heard of. None of them would ever forget what happened next. The Japanese anti-aircraft fire began at 8,000 feet. The sky turned black with flak bursts. Hartwell pushed the Avenger into a dive, aiming for the Shokaku's waterline. The airspeed climbed past 250 miles per hour. The aircraft shook violently as shrapnel tore through the wings. At 3,000 feet, a 25mm shell exploded directly beneath the engine cowling. The Wright R2-600 engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Oil sprayed across the windscreen. Flames licked from beneath the cowling. Hartwell knew immediately that his torpedo run was over. He released the torpedo early, watching it splash harmlessly into the sea hundreds of yards from the carrier. Then he pulled back on the stick, trying to gain altitude, trying to get away from the flak, trying to find somewhere, anywhere, to ditch his dying aircraft. The Avenger limped away from the Japanese fleet at barely 120 miles per hour. The engine was gone. Hartwell was gliding on momentum alone. Behind him, the Japanese carriers grew smaller. Ahead of him, there was nothing but empty ocean. And then the Zero appeared. If you want to see what the Japanese pilot did when he found Hartwell's crippled bomber, please hit that like button. It tells YouTube to share this story with more people, and please subscribe if you haven't already. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto was 31 years old. He had been flying combat missions since the war in China began in 1937. He had fought at Pearl Harbor. He had fought at Midway. He had fought in the Solomon Islands, at Rabaul, at Truk. By June of 1944, he was one of the most experienced fighter pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He was also one of the few veterans still alive. The Japanese Naval Air Force that had swept across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942 was gone. The experienced pilots who had trained for years before the war, the men who could put a bullet through a moving target from 500 meters, the aces who had seemed invincible, most of them were dead. Shot down over Guadalcanal, killed in the meat grinder of the Solomon Islands campaign, lost in the disaster at Midway. Yamamoto had survived because he was careful, he was skilled, and he was lucky. But he knew his luck could not last forever. That morning, he had already shot down 2 American aircraft. A Hellcat fighter that had gotten too aggressive and flown into his gun sights. A Dauntless dive bomber that had been limping home with a damaged engine. 2 more kills to add to his total of 23 confirmed victories. Now he was low on fuel and low on ammunition. His Zero's 20mm cannons had perhaps 30 rounds remaining. His 2 7.7mm machine guns had maybe 200 rounds between them, enough to kill one more American aircraft if he was careful with his shots. He spotted the crippled Avenger from 3 kilometers away. It was trailing smoke. Its engine was clearly dead. The propeller had stopped spinning. The American pilot was gliding toward the ocean, looking for a place to ditch. Yamamoto banked his Zero and began his approach. He came in from behind and below, the classic attack angle. His finger found the trigger. His gun sight settled on the Avenger's tail section. One squeeze. That was all it would take, but Takeshi Yamamoto did not squeeze the trigger. Instead, he pulled his Zero alongside the American bomber and looked through the cockpit canopy at the men inside. He saw the pilot fighting with the controls. He saw the rear gunner slumped in his turret, blood visible on his flight suit. He saw the belly gunner trying to help his wounded crewmate. These men were not fighting. They could not fight. They were just trying to survive. Yamamoto thought about his brother. Kenji Yamamoto had been a pilot too. He had flown with the same carrier air group as Takeshi. They had grown up together in Osaka. They had learned to fly together at Kasumigura Naval Air Station. They had dreamed of becoming aces together. Kenji had died at Midway. His Zero had been hit during an attack on the American carriers. He had managed to shoot down 2 Wildcats before his plane caught fire. Witnesses said he had tried to crash into the deck of the Yorktown, but his burning aircraft had fallen short, plunging into the sea just meters from the ship's hull. Takeshi had never recovered from his brother's death, but he had also learned something from it. He had learned that war was not about glory or honor. War was about survival, and sometimes the most honorable thing a warrior could do was choose not to kill. He made his decision. Takeshi Yamamoto would not shoot down this aircraft. He would not add these men to his kill count. He would not earn another victory mark on the side of his Zero. But now he faced a problem. The American bomber was going to crash into the ocean. Without an engine, the pilot had no choice. He would have to ditch in the middle of the Philippine Sea, hundreds of kilometers from any friendly ship. The chances of rescue were almost zero. If Yamamoto simply flew away, the Americans would die anyway. They would drown, or die of thirst, or be eaten by sharks. His mercy would be meaningless. Unless he did something more. Takeshi Yamamoto made the most dangerous decision of his life. He would not just spare the American bomber, he would guide it to safety. In the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was unthinkable. A Japanese pilot who helped the enemy would face court-martial. If found guilty, the sentence was death. There would be no defense, no appeal, no mercy. The code of Bushido demanded absolute loyalty to the emperor. Showing compassion to the enemy was betrayal of the highest order. Yamamoto knew exactly what he was risking. He did it anyway. He pulled his Zero alongside the Avenger's cockpit and looked at the American pilot through the shattered canopy. The young man's face was covered in oil and blood. His eyes were filled with terror. He clearly expected to die in the next few seconds. Yamamoto raised his hand. He pointed to the northwest. He was trying to tell the American to follow him. Jimmy Hartwell did not understand. He thought the Japanese pilot was ordering him to surrender, to crash into the sea, to die. He shook his head. Yamamoto pointed again. This time he made a flying motion with his hand, then pointed to himself, then pointed northwest again. "Follow me." Hartwell still did not understand. His Avenger was losing altitude. The ocean was getting closer. In a few minutes he would have to ditch whether he wanted to or not. Yamamoto realized he had only one option left. He flew ahead of the Avenger and began waggling his wings. Left, right, left, right. The universal signal for "follow me." Then he banked to the northwest and began flying slowly just above stall speed, giving the crippled Avenger time to keep up. Hartwell watched the Zero pull ahead of him. Every instinct told him this was a trap. The Japanese pilot was leading him into an ambush. There were probably more Zeros waiting over the horizon, ready to tear his aircraft apart. But what choice did he have? His engine was dead. His aircraft was falling. He was going to crash into the ocean in a few minutes no matter what he did. He decided to follow. For the next 43 minutes, the strangest procession in the history of the Pacific War flew northwest across the Philippine Sea, a Japanese Zero flying at barely 100 miles per hour, leading a crippled American Avenger toward an unknown destination. Yamamoto kept checking his fuel gauge. The needle was dropping steadily. He had maybe 20 minutes of fuel left. If he didn't find what he was looking for soon, he would crash into the ocean too. Then he saw it. A small island on the horizon, green vegetation, a sandy beach, fresh water. Yamamoto did not know the name of this island. It was one of hundreds of tiny atolls scattered across the Philippine Sea. Most of them were uninhabited. Some of them had small Japanese garrisons. Some of them had been bypassed by both sides and forgotten. This one looked empty. No ships in the lagoon, no aircraft on the beach, no signs of military activity at all. Yamamoto flew over the island once, checking for threats. Nothing. Just palm trees, sand, and a small freshwater pond in the centre of the island. He circled back toward the Avenger and pointed down at the beach. Land here. Hartwell understood this time. He lined up his approach and brought the Avenger down onto the shallow water just off the beach. The aircraft hit with a tremendous splash, the propeller digging into the sand, the fuselage lurching forward and then settling back. Water flooded into the cockpit. Hartwell scrambled out of the aircraft. He helped Brennan pull the wounded Kowalski from the turret. The three Americans waded through the chest-deep water toward the beach, dragging their survival equipment behind them. When they reached the sand, they turned around and looked up. The Japanese Zero was still circling overhead. Takeshi Yamamoto looked down at the three Americans standing on the beach. They were alive. They had made it. His decision had mattered. But his fuel gauge was now showing empty. The needle was below the red line. His engine would die any second. He had two choices. He could try to make it back to his carrier, knowing he would almost certainly run out of fuel over the open ocean and drown, or he could land on this island and become a prisoner of the men he had just saved. The engine coughed. Yamamoto made his decision. He banked the Zero toward the beach and began his approach. The engine died completely at 200 feet. He was now a glider, just like the American had been. He brought the Zero down onto the beach in a perfect dead-stick landing. The aircraft slid across the sand, its wings throwing up sprays of white powder, its landing gear collapsing under the stress. The Zero came to rest 50 meters from where the Americans were standing. For a long moment, no one moved. Jimmy Hartwell stared at the Japanese pilot climbing out of his cockpit. He was wearing a leather flying helmet and goggles. He was carrying a pistol on his hip. He looked exhausted. The two men locked eyes. Hartwell reached for his own sidearm. His fingers closed around the grip of his .45 caliber pistol. Yamamoto saw the movement. He slowly raised his hands above his head. Then, very deliberately, he unbuckled his pistol belt and let it fall to the sand. He walked toward the Americans with his hands still raised. He stopped 10 feet away from Hartwell and bowed deeply. When he straightened up, he spoke in heavily accented English. "I am Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, Imperial Japanese Navy. I surrender to you." Hartwell's hand was still on his pistol. His mind was racing. This made no sense. The Japanese pilot had spared them. He had led them to safety, and now he was surrendering? "Why?" Hartwell asked. "Why did you save us?" Yamamoto was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Because you could not fight. And killing men who cannot fight is not war. It is murder." He paused. "My brother would have understood." The four men spent 17 days on that island. They had limited supplies, some emergency rations from the Avenger, a first aid kit that allowed them to treat Kowalski's wounds, a hand-cranked emergency radio that Brennan tried to operate every day, sending out distress signals that no one seemed to receive, and they had each other. At first, there was tension. Hartwell and his crew did not trust Yamamoto. They made him sleep separately from them. They watched him constantly. They kept their weapons close. But as the days passed, something changed. Yamamoto proved to be invaluable for survival. He knew how to fish using improvised hooks and lines. He knew which plants on the island were edible and which were poisonous. He knew how to build a shelter from palm fronds that kept them dry during the tropical rainstorms. He also tended to Kowalski's wounds with more skill than any of the Americans. He cleaned the injuries daily. He fashioned bandages from strips of parachute silk. He made a poultice from local plants that helped prevent infection. "Where did you learn this?" Hartwell asked him one evening. "My mother was a nurse," Yamamoto said. "She worked in a hospital in Osaka. When I was a boy, I would watch her treat patients. She taught me that healing is as important as fighting." On the 8th day, Kowalski's fever finally broke. He was going to survive. That night, for the first time, the four men ate dinner together. They sat around a small fire eating fish that Yamamoto had caught and coconuts that Brennan had collected. They talked. Yamamoto told them about his brother, about growing up in Osaka, about his mother, the nurse, and his father, the school teacher, about learning to fly at the naval air station, feeling the freedom of the open sky, believing that he was serving something greater than himself. Hartwell told Yamamoto about Oklahoma, about his family's farm, about his high school sweetheart, Mary Ellen, who was waiting for him back home, about joining the Navy after Pearl Harbor because he felt he had to do something, had to fight, had to make a difference. Brennan talked about Boston, about his Irish immigrant parents, about his dream of becoming a radio engineer after the war. Kowalski, still weak from his injuries, talked about Chicago, about working in the stockyards before the war, about his mother's pierogi and his father's stories about the old country. By the end of the night, the four enemies had become something else. Not friends, exactly. The war was still happening. Their countries were still trying to destroy each other, but something had shifted. They had seen each other as human beings. On the 17th day, an American PBY Catalina flying boat spotted their signal fire and landed in the lagoon. The rescue crew was stunned to find 3 American airmen and 1 Japanese pilot living together on the island. The Navy officer in charge immediately took Yamamoto into custody. The Japanese pilot would be transported to a prisoner of war camp for interrogation. Before they were separated, Yamamoto approached Hartwell. He bowed again, as he had on the first day. "I hope you find your Mary Ellen," he said. "I hope you have many children. I hope you live a long life." Hartwell's eyes filled with tears. He extended his hand. Yamamoto took it. They shook hands for a long moment. Then the Navy guards led Yamamoto away, and Jimmy Hartwell never saw him again. Or so he thought. If this story's moving you, please hit the like button right now. It really does help us share these incredible stories with more people. And if you want to see how this ends, stay with us. The reunion is coming. The war ended in August of 1945. Jimmy Hartwell went home to Oklahoma. He married Mary Ellen 3 months after his discharge. He used his GI Bill benefits to go to college. He became an engineer. He and Mary Ellen had 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, and eventually 11 grandchildren. He never forgot Takeshi Yamamoto. Every year on June 19th, Hartwell would think about the Japanese pilot who had saved his life. He would wonder if Yamamoto had survived the prisoner of war camp. He would wonder if he had made it home to Japan. He would wonder if he was still alive. But he had no way to find out. The war was over. Japan was rebuilding. The world was moving on. And Hartwell had been ordered by Navy intelligence officers never to speak of what had happened. The story of a Japanese pilot showing mercy to American airmen was too complicated, too confusing, too dangerous for the simple narrative of good versus evil that both countries wanted to believe. Hartwell obeyed. He kept the secret. Takeshi Yamamoto survived the prisoner of war camp. He was held in California until 1946, then repatriated to Japan. He returned to Osaka and found his city in ruins. The firebombing campaigns of 1945 had destroyed most of the city. His parents' house was gone. His mother had died in the bombing. His father had died of illness shortly after. Yamamoto had lost everything. He spent the next decade rebuilding his life. He worked as a fisherman. He worked as a construction labourer. He worked on the docks. loading cargo onto ships that were carrying Japanese goods to America, the country that had destroyed his homeland and then helped to rebuild it. In 1957, he got married. His wife's name was Akiko. She was a school teacher, like his father had been. They had one son, whom they named Kenji, after the brother Takeshi had lost at Midway. Yamamoto never told anyone about the American bomber he had saved. Not his wife, not his son, not anyone. The story was too complicated, too painful, too connected to a war that Japan wanted to forget. Both men carried the memory of June 19th, 1944. Both men wondered about the other. Both men kept their secrets locked inside. 47 years passed. In 1991, Jimmy Hartwell was 70 years old. He had retired from engineering. His children were grown. His grandchildren were starting to have children of their own. He had lived a good life, a full life, exactly the kind of life that Takeshi Yamamoto had hoped for him. But something was missing. Hartwell had never been able to thank the man who saved him. He had never been able to tell Yamamoto what his act of mercy had meant. He had never been able to show him the family that existed because of his decision not to pull the trigger. He decided to try to find him. The search was almost impossible. Hartwell did not know if Yamamoto was still alive. He did not know where he lived. He did not even know how to spell his name correctly in Japanese. He contacted the United States Navy. No records. He contacted the Japanese Self-Defense Force, the organization that had replaced the Imperial Japanese military. No records. He wrote to Japanese veterans organizations, to historians, to anyone who might have information about a pilot named Yamamoto who had served on the carrier Shokaku. Months passed. Every lead went cold. In 1993, Hartwell was invited to speak at a reunion of his old air group in San Diego. Veterans from Air Group 15 gathered to remember the Battle of the Philippine Sea, to honor the men who had died, to celebrate the men who had survived. Someone asked Hartwell if he had any memorable combat stories. For the first time in 49 years, he told the truth. He described the crippled bomber. He described the Zero appearing on his wing. He described the Japanese pilot leading him to safety. He described the 17 days on the island. He described the handshake before they were separated. The room was silent when he finished. After the reunion, a retired naval intelligence officer approached Hartwell. He said he had contacts in Japan who might be able to help. He said the Japanese government had been opening some wartime records. He said there might be a way to find the pilot. 3 months later, Hartwell received a phone call. The voice on the other end spoke English with a Japanese accent. "Mr. Hartwell, my name is Kenji Yamamoto. I am calling about my father." Kenji Yamamoto had learned his father's secrets 6 months earlier. Takeshi Yamamoto was 80 years old. He had been diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctor said he had 6 months to live, maybe a year if he was lucky. On his hospital bed, Takeshi had finally told his son the truth. He had told him about the American bomber he had saved. He had told him about the 17 days on the island. He had told him about the handshake with the American pilot. "I never knew if he survived," Takeshi said. "I never knew if my decision mattered. I have wondered for almost 50 years. Kenji promised his father he would try to find out. When the inquiry from the retired American intelligence officer reached Japan, it was forwarded to a veterans organization that Kenji had contacted. Within weeks, the connection was made. Jimmy Hartwell was alive. He was living in Oklahoma. He had been searching for Takeshi Yamamoto for 2 years. The two families began exchanging letters. Hartwell sent photographs of his children and grandchildren. He sent a letter explaining what Yamamoto's act of mercy had meant to him. He sent his gratitude across the ocean, 49 years late but finally delivered. Takeshi Yamamoto read the letter in his hospital room. His hands trembled as he held the photographs. He saw the faces of children and grandchildren who existed because he had lifted his finger from the trigger. He began to cry. When Kenji asked him what was wrong, Takeshi shook his head. "Nothing is wrong," he said. "Everything is right. For the first time in 49 years, everything is right. In April of 1994, Jimmy Hartwell flew to Japan. He was 73 years old. His hair had turned white. His body carried the scars of a war that had ended half a century ago. But his heart was pounding like he was 23 again. Kenji Yamamoto met him at Osaka Airport. He drove Hartwell to a hospital on the outskirts of the city. Takeshi Yamamoto was waiting in his room. He was 81 years old. His body was thin from the cancer. His face was lined with age. But his eyes were the same eyes that had looked across at Hartwell through the cockpit canopy over the Philippine Sea. The two men saw each other. For a moment, neither moved. 49 years of wondering. 49 years of silence. 49 years of carrying a secret that no one else would understand. Then Jimmy Hartwell walked to the hospital bed and took Takeshi Yamamoto's hand. "You saved my life," Hartwell said. "You saved my crew. You gave me my wife, my children, my grandchildren, everything I have. I have waited 49 years to say 2 words to you." He squeezed Yamamoto's hand. "Thank you." Takeshi Yamamoto smiled. Tears streamed down his face. "You are welcome," he said. "I would do it again." They talked for 3 hours. They talked about the war. They talked about the island. They talked about the years that had passed and the lives they had lived. Hartwell had brought photographs, not just of himself, but of his children, his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren, all the people who existed because Yamamoto had chosen mercy over victory. Yamamoto looked at each photograph carefully. His hands trembled as he held them. "This is my legacy," he said finally. "This is better than any medal, better than any honor. These faces are my reward." Takeshi Yamamoto died 3 months later, in July of 1994. He was 81 years old. He passed away in Osaka, the city where he had been born, the city where he had learned to dream of flying. Jimmy Hartwell received the news in Oklahoma. He wept for hours, but he also felt at peace. Yamamoto had died knowing the truth. The American bomber had made it home. The crew had survived. The decision he had made over the Philippine Sea in 1944 had mattered. His act of mercy had rippled across generations. Hartwell lived another 12 years. He died in 2006 at the age of 85. His obituary in the Oklahoma newspaper mentioned his service in World War II, his career as an engineer, his 59 years of marriage to Mary Ellen. It did not mention Takeshi Yamamoto, but Hartwell's family knew. His children knew. His grandchildren knew. His great-grandchildren would know. And now you know too. The story of Jimmy Hartwell and Takeshi Yamamoto did not become famous like some other stories from the war. There was no best-selling book. There was no Hollywood movie. There was no heavy metal song. But perhaps that made it more precious, not less. Some acts of mercy are meant to be quiet. Some acts of honor happen in silence. Some connections between enemies are never meant for the history books. What matters is not whether the world remembers. What matters is whether it happened at all. On June 19th, 1944, in the middle of the largest carrier battle in history, one Japanese pilot made a choice. He chose not to kill. He chose to save. He chose humanity over hatred, compassion over conquest, mercy over murder. He followed a code that transcended nations and flags. He answered what he might have called a higher call. And because of that choice, 57 people are alive today who would never have been born. 57 descendants of Jimmy Hartwell, Thomas Brennan, and William Kowalski. Teachers, doctors, engineers, parents, children. An entire tree of human lives, all growing from a single moment of grace. The war demanded that Takeshi Yamamoto kill his enemies. Honor demanded something different. He chose honor. And that choice echoes still. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're bringing you forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about pilots who chose mercy over victory. Stories about enemies who became brothers. real humanity in the midst of destruction. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, Japan, Germany, the Philippines? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if this story reminded you of anyone you know. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jimmy Hartwell and Takeshi Yamamoto are never forgotten. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.